Tonight I'm sharing some truly terrifying Bigfoot encounters, so keep a sharp ear out for anything moving in the trees around you, and most importantly, stay on the trail. Lenny and Stacy Freitas were not out looking for Bigfoot the day their worldview changed forever. The 43-year-old husband and 39-year-old wife were on their way to a pet sitting job on McCord Road at the edge of the northeast corner of Rock County in late spring of 2005. The time was about an hour before sunset, and the couple was enjoying the rustic scenery along the drive. They noticed a farmer in a field next to the road, and remarked to one another how strange it was that he had turned on every light on his tractor, even with a few spotlights added, even though the sun still shone brightly. Then they saw what may have caused the farmer to ramp up his wattage. Ahead in the distance, something tall and dark stepped out of a dense cluster of trees and onto the road. Lenny kept driving, wondering whether it was an animal or a person, but as they drew closer, he found it was neither. He described it as upright and of medium brown colour, walking quickly but easily on two legs. Lenny realised, as the creature ducked behind a road sign, that it stood at least 7 feet tall and weighed a minimum of 350 pounds, probably more. It had crossed a 20-foot wide road in only 2 long strides, and he could make out a humanoid face with no muzzle and fur that obscured its ears and neck. Stacy had seen it too, and both of them felt the hair rise up on their arms and the backs of their necks. By then they were almost to the spot where the creature had crossed, and as they reached it, Lenny craned for another glimpse of it, but it was nowhere to be seen. He realised at that moment that the creature had quickly hidden itself and was probably watching them, aware it had been seen. The road on that side dropped into a 4-foot deep depression, filled with weeds and backed by a cultivated field. The Bigfoot, and Lenny and Stacy are sure that that's what it was, had most likely flattened itself in that ditch. The Feituses never reported their sighting to the authorities and kept it mostly to themselves. Since then they've kept a very low profile and have done nothing to call attention to their experience. The fact that the sighting was in daylight and they both had a good look at the creature rules out explanations like hallucination or misidentification. The accompanying terrain and a slew of corroborating reports puts this sighting into the category of very interesting, especially as McCord Road lies just east of a large wild swamp area called the Lima Marsh. This 2-mile road is also sandwiched between Lake Koshkonong and North and Whitewater Lakes, which back up into the southernmost tip of the dense Kettle Moraine State Forest. Overall, it's a very rural area with many small, lightly travelled roads and a good supply of deer, pheasants, turkey and other small game, not to mention the occasional hen house and cornfield to pilfer. A large, hardy omnivore could conceivably raise a small family here quite easily. Then there were the other sightings. Only about a month before the Freitas incident, a student was heading home from a late-night job at a local movie theatre and was heading west on State Highway 59 near the Lima Marsh Wildlife Area, when she saw a tall, dark and hairy creature standing by the side of the highway, watching her as she passed. In 1999, halfway between Elkhorn and Whitewater near North Lake, a Chicago computer salesman named Joe was on his way to fish. He was about a mile north of Millard on County Highway 0 when he noticed movement on the east side of the road through his passenger window. He slowed his car, and as he peered out the window, he saw a 7-foot, 400-pound creature walking through the tall grass in a ditch. He said as it walked, it was swinging its long arms from massive shoulders and leaning slightly forward, as if it was intent on where it was going. It was covered in rust-brown fur that appeared uneven and unkempt, and as it turned its head to look at him, Joe said his first thought was, "That's not a person." He said the creature's eyes were sunken into the fur that covered its face, and no ears or muzzle were visible. He said it kind of looked like Chewbacca from the Star Wars films, but he kept on driving and didn't look back. Even as far back in 1964, there were reported sightings around the Wisconsin area. A middle-aged Delavan man driving home from work saw a dark, fur-covered creature he identified as a Bigfoot standing in a cornfield to his left. This creature leapt over a 4-foot-plus fence and then ran upright across the road in front of the man's astonished eyes, swinging its long arms as it went. He estimated the creature stood 7 to 8 feet tall and weighed between 400 and 500 pounds. In the 1970s, a region centered around Bluff Road in southern Jefferson County became known as the home of the Bluff Monster. 2 local women who grew up around Palmyra, Judy Wallerman and Rochelle Kemp, described seeing a Bigfoot-like creature on several occasions just off County Highway H on a large rise called Young Hill. The sightings occurred when the women were teenagers. The hill was lit with a huge star every December, and they could sometimes see the creature illuminated by the electric lights of the decoration. Wallerman drew a rough sketch of a hairy, long-armed, human-like creature, and she said they would sit out at night and watch for it. Every now and again, when things got really still, they would see it darting over the hill as if it were chasing something. Other students from their high school also saw the creature, said Wallerman. Around that same time in the 1970s, a woman who lived in Jefferson County called a Department of National Resources officer to report that she had seen a tall, hairy ape-like creature skulking around the buildings on her farm. Agent David Jetson drew out to investigate, but reported that he didn't find anything suspicious at the time. That wasn't until 2 weeks later, when Jetson received another call from the same woman. The creature was back, she said, and its behaviour had escalated. First, the beast marched up to her front door and shook it, as if demanding entry. As the woman cowered in her kitchen, the creature then slashed the frame 7 feet above the porch level with its claws. Then it ran to the barn and attacked one of her horses that was tethered inside, slashing its neck open before stomping off to the woman's garden. She said the animal left big tracks, and although Jetson said he had found no evidence of the footprints, he did say he felt the woman was sincere, and he added the welcome news that the horse survived the attack. 20 years of the supernatural. Don and Peggy Avery's Sasquatch experiences began as the result of an avid interest in the old gold rushes of the 19th century, particularly that of the Klondike, and this interest continued sporadically for nearly 20 years. Don had read many books on the subject and had watched a number of TV programs on the various techniques used in prospecting. So in 1989, when Don and Peggy moved to Eastern Washington and Don began his employment managing a small community, they were really excited to try and find gold. Don said, "Somewhere along the line I became interested in dowsing. I carried a quartz crystal around with me for many years, and I thought that I would attempt to invoke whatever ability I might have at map dowsing for gold deposits. I purchased a Metzger's map of the region and triangulated on a sandbar some 55 miles to the northeast in Snake River. Several weeks later, Peggy and I drove to the area. We had never visited that locale before, and we wandered along the beach for quite some time, distressed by the ribbons of oil that we spotted in the sand. After about an hour of wandering around, feeling like a fool, it dawned on me that I was staring at black sand and not oil-tainted sand. I found a rich ledge a dozen yards inland, and took some samples that I panned down. The effort revealed a flash of gold in my pan. I was hooked. I made several trips to the area, and wound up with a very nice gold button that I retorted from an amalgamation of mercury and hundreds of flakes of fine gold. After months out panning most days, I finally hit upon a spot on a bench above the creek through dowsing and soil sampling. So I filed a mining claim in the summer of 1995, and I fell in love with the area. It's like a slice of heaven, always peaceful, inviting, and provides a strange sense of solitude and calm. It's on a dead end, and very few people ever wander down this road. One man owns most of the mining claims on the creek, and he's dug up the head of the creek to its maximum extent in the last few years. During the Veterans Holiday 3-day weekend in 1996, Peggy and I decided to stay a night in Ellensburg. It snowed that night, the first of the season. It was a wet snow, about 3 to 4 inches, and I parked down by the highway, loaded my pack onto my back, and began the 3/4 of a mile walk into the claim. Peggy decided to stay in the car and read a book, as I made my way up the old mining road. Roughly halfway to my claim, I stopped. I thought I heard crunching in the snow just off the trail around me. I listened as the breeze blowed through the trees, when I heard a guttural, snarling sound coming from a short but steep embankment above the road on my right side. The sound was repeated every 10 to 12 seconds, and reminded me of the sound a man might make just prior to vomiting. I'd say the distance was about 70 to 75 feet away, and I could see something large and furry, or hairy, standing at the edge of a tree line. For the first time in many trips into isolated areas alone, I was armed, so I stayed put, watching and listening for maybe 10 to 12 minutes. At this point I realised that it could have had me any time it had wanted to. Whatever it was, I think it was trying to intimidate me, not injure me. I left my gun holstered and began to walk by it up the road towards my claim. I was very frightened, but I was not going to let it scare me off. It must have already known me from prior trips into the area. It was about 6'5", maybe 6'7". I'm 6'2", and I spent a long time trying to judge his height. I'd never seen a bear or bear signs in the area, but this thing had no snout or conical ears. It was quite stout. I couldn't guess its weight, but it was substantial. Something inside me just told me that it wasn't a bear. I worked the entrance to the underground mine in my prospect hall for about 20 minutes, when I decided to return downhill, just to check if this creature was still around. I was getting hit with wet snow from the trees around me, and I knew my wife must be getting tired of waiting for me, so I decided that once I checked on it, I would head back to the car. I had an old Kodak camera in my pack, but no film, and this has always been a big regret. As I approached the hillside on the way back down the trail, I could see it. The creature had moved about 25 yards along the bank closer to me, and again began its guttural sounds. I must have watched this thing for about 20 minutes that day, and after returning to the car, I mentioned to Peggy that I thought maybe I'd seen a sick bear, only it didn't look or sound like a bear. In late March of the following winter, I stopped by again and walked the road, and the snow had melted down to where the road was passable on foot. When I walked up the trail, I was amazed at what I saw. There were tracks in the snow, made where no man could have any logical reason to go. Some of these tracks were fairly old, but they were all very large. Whatever it was, it appeared to follow a regular route, preferring to stay off the road. It would come part way down one embankment and maybe watch the cars on the highway from behind a bush. I'm guessing that the night lights would attract it. As I went back to this area, I began leaving celery and carrots, but I had no takers. I set up a camcorder to film the area while I was working the claim, but no luck there either. I tried switching to apples and discovered that they started disappearing, especially the red ones. I would pop up there every now and again and leave apples in 5 selected places where I thought he might be. In July of 1999, when I was up there doing some clean-up work, I heard the car door slam down below. Later, after arriving back home, I asked Peggy what had caused her to leave the car. Usually she just sits inside and waits for me while I dig around up there for gold for half hour. She said that while she was sitting in the car, with the silent snow falling all around her, she heard me call her, by her name. I felt a chill, for I rarely call her by her name, only her nickname. We discussed the issue at length, and I still go numb whenever I think about it. In late March of 2000, I stopped by the claim on my way to Tacoma. The sun was out and the snow was very deep. I was several hundred yards below my claim, near the basalt dike and a steep hill, when I noticed fresh tracks going from the stream across the road and up the steep hillside. I could clearly see the toe imprints in the fresh snow, then the knee strike, and then another foot imprint. I was amazed that this thing could run in deep snow unaided. I tried to run up after it, but I fell down and rolled into a ditch. I thought that I was going to drown in snow before I got back to my feet. It must have only been minutes ahead of me. Later that year in August, Peggy and I stopped by the claim. It was about 7 p.m, and we parked down below and exited the car. This time I had the camcorder in hand. We could hear a holler or a high-pitched yell coming from down below us near the stream. As before, it repeated roughly every 10 to 12 seconds. We listened for quite some time, not knowing what to do. I yelled a hello in its direction, and it fell silent. I climbed the hill up to the claim, and after a few minutes I heard something big stomp through the brush down below on the other side of the road. It came toward me. At any second I expected it to burst out from the bush, but it never did. Over time, with me leaving apples for it, it's left me gifts in return. This thing has left me a sandstone block at one of my apple placement sites, several handfuls of wood chips at another, and this chunk of sandstone also gets moved around. I move it back, and it gets moved again. I last made visual contact with the creature in October of 2008, when I attempted to sneak up on it while it was slapping a tree with a rock on the far side of the stream below my claim. But as I got closer, the noise stopped, and once again, there was nothing there. In November of 2008, I visited my site again and left apples for it. When I did, a few hundred yards downhill where Peggy had parked the car, we heard a very strange noise. I've never heard anything like it. It moved on the bank across and above the stream. It wasn't an elk, bear, deer, cat, or bird. I've never heard anything like it. We listened and watched for 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm not certain what it even was. It was a fast and curious sound, almost brazen. Over the nearly 20 years of our bizarre interaction together, I've developed a few observations and opinions. My wife thinks that it knows me, and it communicates with me because I feed it. I've left enough apples to claim it as a dependent. It picks me up at a considerable distance, and approaching the creature while concentrating on only positive thoughts is important. When I approach it, I would always try to leave my worries behind. It is very quick and basically nocturnal, and it seems to know when there's a camera mounted close by, day or night. I also think it knew my car, and sometimes I would get a distinct impression that I might be dealing with a phantom, from the way I would hear it, but never see it as I got closer. They cannot walk quietly through the brush. It sounds more like an elephant. It's territorial, and it works a regular route. The new developments west of this area terrify me. Loss of habitat and more people wandering the woods does not bode well for them. And lastly, it seems to have cognitive abilities that we could only dream about. If it can call my wife's name, having never heard me say it out loud, then perhaps it's telepathic. If you have your own scary story you'd like to submit and hear me read out on the show, then send an email to frombeyondsubmissions@gmail.com. The Honey Creek Hurdler. In 1994, Honey Creek residents David and Mary Pagliaroni received the scare of their lives as they drove home one night on their way back from a nice meal at a local restaurant. They were approaching the Honey Creek Bridge from County Highway DD on the eastern side of Walworth County, about 25 miles southeast of Hebron. As they neared the spot where Honey Lake and Honey Creek met, something tall and red stepped out onto the bridge, illuminated by their car's headlights. David, then 45, and Mary, 44, stared at the hulking, fur-covered creature that stood only 20 feet in front of them. David slammed on the brakes. It froze right in the headlights and just stood there, leaning over. They didn't even reflect the light from his headlights. He said its hair came down off its head and formed a little mini cape. You could see where all the hair ended. The hair came down off his head and formed like a little cape. You could see where the head hair ended, he said. Its long arms hung well below its waist. It appeared larger and heavier than a human. He said no ears were visible, and its face was flat and ape-like. The creature continued to stare into David's eyes for a few seconds, and then turned to take a few steps towards the bridge railing. When it did, it astonished the Pagliaronis even more, as it put one hair-covered hand on the concrete bridge railing, swung both legs over the rail, and then dropped easily to the creek bed 15 to 20 feet below. David noted that his feet were also heavily fur-covered, and that it had no tail. He drew a sketch at the time that showed an upright ape-like creature leaning toward their car. Mary noted that although she and David never had any problem sharing their feelings about things, neither said a word to each other about what they had seen for weeks. David said he just wanted to leave the area. Despite the fact that he was a Vietnam War veteran and an avid hunter and outdoorsman, his instincts immediately told him to leave the creature alone. The Frankfort sighting. A Frankfort resident named Rita Massman thought UFOs had something to do with the 8-foot-tall Bigfoot her children saw on several occasions near their home in July 1991. A neighbour had seen a UFO, she explained to a reporter at the time, and then after that, the Bigfoot began to make his presence known. Because the creature seems to prefer to hide rather than attack, some people have come to think of it almost affectionately. Investigators call this Harry and the Hendersons syndrome, referring to the old film about a family that adopts a Sasquatch. However, the Massman's experience involved a creature that seemed to have adopted them in a shadowy sort of way. Neither Massman nor her husband Klaus actually laid eyes on the creature, but their 4 children cited 5 separate sightings between July 11th and the 17th of that year. One boy, Raymond, said he saw it 3 times. He first heard a strange clapping sound in the woods. Then he noticed his dog making fearful, squeaking sounds. After that he saw a tall, grey furred creature run towards the shed where he'd just put away his bicycle. He said it was tall as the eave on the shed, and Raymond told us that the eave is 8 feet above the ground. He said it stopped and looked at him. He said he could see its eyes and the nose, and then as quickly as it came, it ran back into the woods. Raymond saw it again, near the shed, and he also saw it run past his bedroom window one night while he was resting in bed. Rita Massman said she felt that it watched her when she worked outside on their thickly forested 80-acre property. When their pen chickens started to disappear, despite a gate that required fingers to open it, they called the sheriff and requested both the United States Army and the state DNR to be called in to conduct a high-tech search of the land. The sheriff did call the DNR for them, and the Massmans gave the sheriff's department a fur shred they had found on a shrub to examine, but the official who came to the farm said only that it could be from a dog, and confiscated it. A local reporter who called the Marathon County Sheriff's investigators that took the sample said they didn't return his calls after they knew what his line of inquiry was about. After this, the Massmans kept finding trampled areas they believe had been made by the grey giant. and Klaus Massman said that he heard something big stalking him when he went into the woods. Something that stopped and waited quietly every time he stopped walking. After this, the Massmans were afraid for their children and stopped giving them a free run at the farm. They even resorted to homemade alarm systems, such as ropes strung across the ground with various noisemakers attached, and they began carrying a pistol or a knife any time they were outside. After a year of this, a psychic heard about the family's fright came to communicate telepathically with the unseen invader. She told it to leave, and afterwards it appeared to do so. That seemed to be the end of their ordeal, but there was another report of a creature seen in conjunction with strange lights in the sky. In the 90s, a group of teen boys that spent a lot of time outdoors observed very bright, close lights right before a bizarre creature began to appear over the course of a year or so. They said any time they saw it, they could see how massive it was, and it stood more than 6 feet tall on 2 clawed feet, with large yellow slanted eyes, upright pointed ears, and greyish tan skin. It could run on 2 or 4 feet, and the fact they repeatedly saw the strange lights when the creature was in the same vicinity lends some corroboration to the Massman's claims. Maybe it was the same creature. It wasn't human. In the late 80s, Ross Tams, a 30-something plumber, drove his girlfriend Beth to her parents' house on a warm spring day. He said it was about 11 a.m. and they were on a street whose name he couldn't recall, approaching a farmhouse. He said he was admiring the house due to its position alongside a hill to the west and a large amount of huge evergreens to its north. As I was looking at the house, he said, I noticed a brown clump at the edge of the driveway where the drive met the street. And the closer we got, the slower I drove. I was so alarmed by what I was seeing, I just about drove us off the road as we went past it. Once I finally regained my composure and asked Beth what this was, she just didn't respond. I asked again, this time turning toward her. She had her hands tightly grasping the dash. Her face was frozen and white. I asked her what I thought she was, and she said, that thing was kneeling and holding out its massive arms. I told her we're the only species that kneels, and she asked if I noticed what was in its arms. I said I thought it was holding something, but I was a bit busy trying not to run the car off the road, and it seemed to stare at me with these black human-like eyes which really freaked me out. It was a little dog, said Beth. Small, black and white. It was dead. I asked if she was kidding, and joked that the dog was probably its next meal, but she got mad and insisted the thing looked like it just lost its best friend. She said when she looked into its eyes and it was holding that dog, it looked sad. Afterwards, Ross described the thing as huge. He said I was working in plumbing back then and I had a very good eye for measurements because I was working with them daily, measuring stuff up by eye. It definitely had humanistic qualities. It had very broad shoulders and a wide neck. At least it seemed so because of the amount of hair. I'd say the hair was 3 to 4 inches long all over its body, seemingly uniform, and was a reddish-brown colour. The face was black, almost mask-like, something like that of a great ape. But the eyes, they were remarkably human. It almost looked surprised when it made eye contact with me as I drove past, like it got caught with its hand in the cookie jar. As we passed it, because our windows were partly open, an incredible odour entered the car. The stench was so bad that both of us literally felt as if we were going to be sick. Beth wanted to turn round afterwards and go back to confirm what we had just saw. Was it really there, holding that dog? Over my dead body, I said. As far as I'm concerned, the faster we get away from the damn thing, the better. The Blue Ridge Bounder. About 10:30 at night, I was riding along one of our back roads in a very rural area with my girlfriend at the time. We came to an area of the road that had an embankment on the left and a house with a white split wood fence on the right. All of a sudden, a big brown hairy thing jumped off the embankment down onto the road and landed in front of my car. I had to stomp the brakes hard so I wouldn't hit the thing, and the embankment it jumped off was a good 5 feet high, and when the thing hit the road, it never even slowed down. It just took it in its stride. It looked over at the car while never missing a step. In 3 steps, it was all the way across the road. Then it leapt over a fence that was around 4 to 4.5 feet tall, like it wasn't even there. I saw it as it ran down into the yard, but I couldn't see where it went from there. It scared us both half to death. I haven't seen anything like it since, although one of our local papers did print an article once of a big brown creature that was in one particular spot of a local river, and each time it was spotted, it was reported to be eating a fish that it had caught, as if it was hunting to survive. I've lived in rural Georgia all my life, and I've seen a lot of wild animals. I've seen bears on 2 legs, deer jump over bushes and logs. Even though this thing matched the commonly accepted descriptions of a Bigfoot, I still think it was some sort of natural animal species, just not one that we normally encounter. Whatever these things are, I know for a fact that they're here in Georgia, and maybe someday we'll find out what it was. Sasquatch of the swamps. Floridians have a name for things that look and act like Bigfoot. The skunk ape. Maybe it's the state's swamp water combined with the heat and high humidity that intensifies its scent, but the creature gets its name from the pungent aroma that often announces its presence before it's actually seen. Writer and investigator Charlie Carlson said in Weird, Florida, in response to thousands of sightings, the state legislature in April 1977 introduced a bill to protect the elusive man-ape. The bill was never passed, but the mere attempt to pass it shows how many people take their skunk apes very seriously in the area. One woman's encounter in the Lakeland area, near the centre of the state, made the Orlando Sentinel in 2004. She said it happened in August of that year, a week after Hurricane Charlie had hit, as she drove with her 2 sleeping daughters along a rural road near sundown. The first thing she noticed was something crouched in a ditch. As she focused on the creature, she said it became aware of her too, and rose, intimidatingly, to a standing position. When he saw me, he was as surprised as I was. I slowed down to a stop, but I didn't stop fully because I was too scared. It was almost dark, but I could see it clearly. Ward said that she estimated its standing height at between 6 and 8 feet, and it was covered with a fur that hid its ears and nose. She said it stood, with hands drawn up next to its body, and she could see its full lips, which reminded her of the texture of a dog's paw. She said around its eyes were white, which is an often observed trait of the so-called swamp ape around the Florida region. She said she kept the sighting to herself at first, afraid people would make fun of her. Before the news story broke, Ward was interviewed by a Florida writer and cryptozoologist called Scott Marlowe, who wrote a more detailed account of her story in his book, The Cryptid Creatures of Florida. It gives a better picture of the woman's initial trauma, her impulse to fill sketchbooks, and even one wall of her kitchen with drawings of this creature, and reveals that she did later find footprints similar to that of a cast that had been made in 1983 in Ocala National Forest. Much media attention and multiple interactions with various Bigfoot research organisations and her story became one of the best known skunk ape encounters in recent memory. Ankles like tree stumps. This truly unique sighting occurred around 1977 in Michigan, in the same region of the huge Manistee National Forest. The man who sent me this report is middle-aged now, but was in his late 20s at the time. The sighting occurred as he and his brother were riding Honda trail bikes on state land, and it was around noon on a clear, sunny, warm day. The man had stopped on the trail to wipe some dust off his face, when suddenly he had the feeling of being watched. About 7 feet off the ground, he saw a face looking at him from behind a tree. He said they made eye contact, and then the creature ran away on thick hind legs. He described it as entirely covered with very black fur, and muscular, with arms longer than a human's. He added that he didn't see any features that indicated whether it was male or female, but there was one extremely strange thing about it. The witness's brother had ridden on ahead and was unaware of the creature, but the witness chased the beast for a short way on his trail bike, keeping a distance of about 20 yards and watching it easily bound over fallen trees as it ran away from him. He said he saw very clearly that each of the creature's big ankles, which he described as the size of tree stumps, were both encircled by a band of dark red-coloured fur that stood in obvious contrast to the black fur on the rest of its body. The witness felt the creature meant him no harm. He also felt that it wanted him to see it. In fact, he was so affected by the experience that he said he has neither hunted nor killed any animal since then. He had never had any other type of unusual experience before that day, and hasn't had another one since. And he said when he watches these so-called experts on TV talking about Bigfoot, he just laughs to himself now, because he knows that it's true. The Washington Wildling. The heavily forested state of Washington, together with North California, has long been considered Bigfoot Central, and is still a leading provider of encounter reports. It would take a shelf of books to chronicle the recollections of the 1,000 people who were convinced they've had a personal encounter with Bigfoot in the area. In 1977, professional trumpet player Dean DeWeese, whose career included stints with the Four Tops and Lawrence Welk, heard his dog start a ruckus outside his cabin one night. He and his nephew Dave armed themselves, and as they came outside, they discovered an 8 to 9 foot tall, upright creature methodically arranging the 5 chickens it had just killed in Dewey's coop into a neat line. Dave had a shotgun, so he fired first, and he hit the creature's rear end. They were shocked. It stood there, as if nothing had happened. It just casually walked away, leaving the chickens it had killed behind. The men followed it, and Dean unloaded birdshot in its direction from his pistol, only to watch it cross the creek in a single 15-foot bound and run away into the woods. The men, thinking at least it hadn't made away with the dead birds, went back. But when they returned, only one chicken carcass still laid there. Something, perhaps a hunting accomplice, had snuck in as the men chased the creature down to the creek and taken the rest. Dean described the Sasquatch, for he had no doubt that's what it was, as covered in greyish-white fur that hung long over its shoulders and down to its back. You've got to see these things to really believe it. I saw it, and I have no doubt in my mind of what I saw, said Dean. White Bluff Screamer. Williamson County has produced a handful of Bigfoot sightings over the years, including a report from South Lick Creek from the early 1970s, as well as another report of a grey-coloured ape-man that crossed the road in front of a vehicle in 2010. High-pitched screams are some of the most common vocalizations associated with these specific Bigfoot creatures. An account of grey or white-haired Sasquatch is less common, but not unheard of, especially around this area. Perhaps they're albinos, or perhaps, like the hair of other animals, their hair loses its pigmentation as they grow older. If this is the case, the deep woods of central Tennessee may harbour a retirement community for excessively vocal, screaming Bigfoot creatures. Throughout the hills and hollows of northern central Tennessee, there exists colourful folklore that speaks of a monster known as the White Bluff Screamer. As with most local legends, descriptions of this particular creature seem to vary widely depending on who you ask. Yet most of the old-timers will tell you that it's said to be a tall, shaggy, white three-toed creature with a long neck and flat face that has acquired a taste for both dogs and the local livestock. In 2010, a woman called Brenda related a brief encounter that might lend a measure of truth to this tale. Brenda said, "Me, my friend and her sister went camping at this place out in the middle of nowhere with our kids. It had a nice place to swim, but it got late and our fire went out. We didn't take tents with us, so we slept in our cars, and my friend and I were about asleep when my friend's sister, who was parked right behind us, turned on her headlights and yelled to us to turn on ours. When we did, we saw two big, dirty, white, hairy things that stood 6 feet tall and were slightly hunched over. It was only a split second we saw them before they disappeared. They moved extremely quickly. My friend and I saw 2 of them, but her sister said when she yelled at us, there was 4 around our car. We have no idea what we saw, but it made me think of all the stories I had heard growing up. And after we saw it, we packed up and went home." The Bogwish. In the spring of 1918, William Hall was out hunting for the family's needs with his good friend. In this case, he was bear hunting 8 miles west of Kemano in a small area known as Miscook. He and his friend were joined by an elder, whose job it was to wait in the canoe and watch their supplies. As William and his friend made their way through the terrain, they came upon a split in the valley. It was here where they went their separate ways. As the custom went, a wooden stake was pounded into the ground. Upon return, the first hunter would remove it and lay it on the path to let the other know he had safely arrived back, and to meet him down at the river's edge when he returned. William, being the first man to return, did so, and started his way back to the waiting elder in the canoe. It was here on a small trail he came upon a group of 4 Sasquatch, or as they're known to the Kitimat Indians, the Bogwish. In absolute terror he started to run, but apparently blacked out. When he came to, he found himself on a large rock, and the 4 Bogwish were below, reaching out and attempting to grab the startled hunter. In his own native tongue he spoke to them, and said that he was not there to harm them, but only hunting for food for his family. It was at this time that they backed off, as if they understood what he had just said. The creatures seemed to follow him the rest of the way, and as he made it back to the canoe, the elder could see them in the tree line. He called out to them in his language, saying that they were not out to harm them. Again, seeming to understand, the creatures left. Upon getting back into the canoe, William Hall slipped into a coma that lasted 4 days. It was on the 5th day that he awoke, with a strange smell accompanying his body. It's well reported that there's a really horrible, rotten, foul odour that fills the air whenever a Sasquatch is near. Friends of William said he had the same rancid odour permeating from his body until the day he died, 8 years after his encounter. So bad was the smell coming off him that he built a hut for himself to sleep in, so as not to offend his family. Since the day he came out of the coma, he could foresee the future and started displaying other traits of a psychic nature. One night around the campfire, William gathered the elders and chief of his tribe to experience his newly acquired supernatural powers. He picked a salmonberry branch that was bare of any leaf or fruit, as it was now the fall. He walked past the chief, who was seated, displayed the branch, and then proceeded to walk around a circle of hot coals and fire. After the first time around, he stopped in front of the chief, this time displaying a freshly grown leaf on the branch. A second time he walked around the hot coals on the fire, and this time around, when he made it back to the chief, the branch had a large bud that had grown upon it, and upon the third encompass of the fire, the branch now yielded a full rose. Perhaps the most stunning display of William's powers came when he warned his people of a snake-like creature with bugs attached to it that would destroy their land. 20 or so years later, after this prediction, the Alcan project began. This snake-like creature was believed to have been the winding black highway put in, and the bugs that he described attached to it were the many trucks that ride over that road, ruining the natural land. His grandson also said that William had picked out the day of his death and knew what would happen to him years before it happened. Thanks for tuning in for tonight's episode. If you ever had an encounter with Bigfoot or anything paranormal, let me know in the comments down below. Or if you'd like me to share your story on the show, drop me an email at frombeyondsubmissions@gmail.com. And I'll see you next time.